Allow me to call this meeting to order.
Gathered here are dignitaries from a section of the 50 election observer groups who are accredited by the government to observe the January 15th presidential and parliamentary elections. The election observers are drawn from a joint team from the African Union, Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, together with the East African Community Observer Mission, Eastern Africa Standby Forces, and the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. The African Union team, led by former Nigerian President Jonathan Goodluck, was critical of the directives issued by the Chief of the Defense Forces, tasking the electorate to leave polling stations soon after casting the vote.
But then the Chief of the Ugandan Defense Force was the first person that was quoted as issued that when we voted to leave, contrary to the law. And this is coming from the very the head of the military, created so much tension in the country.
They observed that the 20-meter radius from which the voters are allowed to stay from the polling station should be maintained for the transparency of the electoral process. They stated that the army should not interfere in elections.
If probably that statement was issued by the East First, the chairperson of the Electoral Commission, which have the authority to do so, citizens would have taken it differently. So security agencies not make statements on election-related issues that are not within their power to do that, so that citizens will not be apprehended.
They advised that the security agencies should uphold human rights and the law to avoid creation of an atmosphere of fear. The recommendation followed reports they received about harassment and arrest of opposition supporters, journalists, and the suspension of several civil society organizations. It is observed that the civic space has greatly shrunk as those perceived critical of the government face a shutdown. Chapter 4 Uganda and the African Center for Media Excellence are some of the civil society organizations whose operations have been suspended lately. All the observer groups criticized the shutdown of the internet by the government.
The mission noted that on 30th January 2026, the Uganda Communications Commission issued a directive suspending public internet access, which had a direct impact on the compilation and analysis of field reports from our observers.
The government should refrain from suspension of internet access close to the election and devise alternative mechanisms of handling potential security threats as opposed to imposing a total nationwide internet shutdown.
The communications regulator shut down the internet 2 days to elections.
The internet restriction directed is in line with the legitimate purpose, that is, protecting national security.
Internet shutdown has become a norm during elections as the country was plunged into a similar digital darkness in 2021. Also, there was a common observation about the late delivery of polling materials across the country, which made polling start hours later.
These delays caused frustrations for voters at some polling stations, with some deciding to leave.
Observers are concerned that the time that was lost was not compensated, despite an announcement by the electoral body extending election time by an hour beyond the stipulated time for closure of voting.
The voting was extended by just 1 hour in most stations to compensate for the delay in opening of the polls. The usual practice is to compensate for the time lost in order to comply with the prescribed duration of voting. Nonetheless, the mission noted some polling stations such as Kasua Primary School and a few others closing at 4 p.m. despite the extension of 1 hour.
They pointed out that the failure of the biometric voter verification kit further complicated the polls, and this was never helped by the communication to polling assistants to use the hard copy of the voters' register to verify voters. The observers issued a plethora of recommendations requiring test technology prior to deployment, streamline the time frame with which to denominate a candidate, printing of ballots should be done after having a clear list of candidates, and early registration of local election observers.
The Electoral Commission needs to minimize cases of denomination of candidates by enhancing mechanisms for verification of requirements before nomination.
Jackson Onyango, NTV.